Hannah Hill is my PhD student. She's doing, and she's writing a brilliant thesis on Amelia Opie, entitled "Strange, Inconsistent Being That I Am: Network Dynamics in the Life and Writings of Amelia Opie." She was awarded a Chase Fellowship, and that was set up to allow a PhD student to come to UEA and to come to the Norfolk Record Office, both to undertake a PhD and also to learn the skills of a working archivist. So she's been very much involved in the Norfolk Records activities over the years, and her thesis, I guess, examines Amelia Opie as a kind of a social chameleon, putting her in the context of the many diverse and very dissimilar networks that she participated in. So looking forward to hearing from Hannah. Thank you.
A poissard, a précieuse, a coquette, and then declined, slipshod, drab. These were some of the words used to describe Amelia Opie, often publicly and often by those who styled themselves her friends during her long career as literary celebrity and political activist. A penance, perhaps, for a woman who so shamelessly lived in the limelight. The first three of these words, poissard, précieuse, coquette, came during the years prior to her commencement, before she became a Quaker in 1825. Interestingly, they're all also French. Poissard meaning a coarse, vulgar woman, literally a fishwife, after the Parisian fishwives who led riots during the French Revolution. Précieuse meaning a pretentious woman affecting overly fine taste or delicacy, and a coquette meaning an insincere one who trifles with male affections. These Gallicized terms reflect the dangers for British women associated with French manners. Those who, as Opie's contemporary Maria Edgeworth put it in her novel Maria, left alone with their nonsense, set about to assemble an audience round them to exhibit themselves in the character of a female politician. This, she writes, is a foolish, vainglorious emulation, an ambition false in its objects, and unsuited to the manners, domestic habits, and public virtue of our country. Opie was ever one to win a crowd, and she understood as well as anyone the danger of declaiming publicly against the status quo, at least without a powerful support network behind you. Once she became a Quaker, though she was arguably more active in political reform than she had been in her radical youth, the gossip surrounding her changed. Once a précieuse, her taste declined. Once a brilliant writer and performer, she became slipshod. Once a coquette, she later appeared drab. The first three sound much more fun, don't they? Opie lived a long life of 84 years and had a long career, but today I'm mainly going to be focusing on what Opie herself labelled her most interesting years, though this is up for discussion. I'll be exploring the networks that supported her in her youth and during the fervour that swept Britain upon the French Revolution. Her most radical years, that is with a capital R, but certainly not the only years that saw her radically redefine what it was to be a politically active woman in the long 18th century. So William Bellow, who wrote the Sexagenarian, was a Norwich-born clergyman, a critic and writer, and who had known Opie from her youth. He harshly criticised the works of many of Opie's friends during his time as editor of the British Critic. This was a conservative publication founded in 1793 and popularised by anti-revolutionary reactionism. As published in its first editorial, the British Critic sought to defend Britain's established religion and the unperverted form of their political constitution. Little wonder, then, that Amelia Opie wrote to her friend Susanna Taylor following the publication of her first acknowledged novel in 1801, "The British Critic is something awful." Though the criticism that provoked her remains unidentified, it may well have come from Bellow himself and quite possibly about her own work. Bellow died in 1817, and his last book was published posthumously the year after. This was The Sexagenarian, or The Recollections of a Literary Life, And in it, he offered many personal accounts of literary figures that he had associated with, not all of these complimentary. Opie herself is described in one chapter, and I've included an extract from this here. He writes, on one occasion, her enthusiasm got the better both of her prudence and the natural delicacy of her sex. She attended the trial of her admired, what should we call him, patriot, Horntook for high treason. When the verdict of not guilty was pronounced, she scrambled over seats and benches as she could, and hastening to where he stood, kissed him in the public court. Scandal indeed. It is important that not only did she allegedly kiss Horntook in the public court, but she scrambled over seats and benches and hastened towards this imprudent, indelicate, and very public act. This in contrast to even the motionless patriot who remained where he stood. Though Opie would, in her later correspondence following this publication, strongly deny she ever did such a thing, it would be interesting to keep in mind this image of her as so run away by her enthusiasm that she climbed over obstacles to take a stand on the political stage. In another extract from Bellow's Sexagenarian, he writes of Opie, her natural connections, her education, and the principles in which she had been brought up gave her an unavoidable predilection in favor of those who, on the breaking out of the French Revolution, vainly imagined that a glorious opportunity was presenting itself for the amelioration of the condition of mankind. I'd like to focus here on these connections, education, and principles in which she had been brought up, and talk a little about what we know of her background. She was born in Norwich in 1769, an only child to a dissenting couple. Her mother, Amelia, died when Opie was 15 years old, and she became an inseparable companion to her doting father, James Alderson, a physician who treated the poor for free at his home clinic. As well as these philanthropic endeavors, he also hosted and visited with many radical thinkers who either lived in or traveled through Norwich. One such man was William Godwin, who, as we've heard already, Amelia met when he came to Norwich in June 1794. On the first day of his stay, Godwin's diary entry records that he met Opie's father for the first time. He writes, Dr. Alderson calls, talk of regulation, this possibly in a philosophical, political, or even a medical sense. Godwin's connection to the county was maintained by his cousin, Mrs. Southern's residence there, but from this familial link grew a host of acquaintances who shared his ideology. After this occasion, until his return to London on the 7th of July, Godwin met with Opie's father, Dr. Alderson, 5 times, on most of these visits dining at Alderson's home, where Godwin's friendship with Amelia, who would have presided over these dinners, quickly developed. Godwin spent at least one occasion during this trip in the company of Amelia unchaperoned by her father, suggesting that their intimacy flourished. And Opie's next meeting with Godwin would occur when she called at his home in Somers Town at the end of August that year, while on her visit to London, for the summer season. This was one such connection made in her father's parlour room, but sustained, at least on Opie's part, I believe, by a desire to associate with those who shared her passion, politics and performance, in oratory and literature, and who could instruct her in these areas. Going anti-clockwise here, we bring John Horntook and Thelwall into the mix. We've already seen the extract from Bellow's memoir on Opie's passion for Tooke, and her admiration for Thelwall was, of course, equally controversial, even within her own radical set. In a letter to Godwin dated 5th of February 1796, for example, she writes, I read your considerations with delight, but alas, I fear my admiration of them has deprived me, in the opinion of many, of all claim to the honourable title of Democrat. I'm afraid I must never show my face at certain political lectures again, unless I choose to run the risk of being pointed at as a spy. She writes again a week later, does Thelwall resent your pamphlet? Has your acquaintance ceased? Godwin's pamphlet, Considerations on Lord Grenville's and Mr. Pitt's Bills, which declaimed against inflammatory political discourse, pointed the finger at Thelwall's particular style. Though she appears to align with Godwin's critique, claiming delight with the pamphlet, soon after this letter, Opie was encouraging Thelwall to come to Norwich to deliver his lectures. Throughout her relationship with Godwin, he frequently lectured Opie about her overly effusive style. And Opie would continue to pay lip service to his philosophy, whilst elsewhere using such impassioned language to express her political beliefs that her own father would later burn the evidence of these views in alarm. But there were people in whom she could confide and to whom she could perform with what Bellow had decried too much enthusiasm. If we turn clockwise from Godwin now, we come to the Plumpters and the Taylors, or the Plumptrees, as I've heard them repeatedly named. Is that something I don't know? Is it Plumptrees? Plumpters? I'm going to go with Plumpters. Right, so two families much more congenial to Opie's early radical years. No. And back. There we go. So there are two letters written by Anne Plumpter that are held at the Norfolk Record Office, which highlight the connections between some of these Norwich patriots, as they were known, and gives us a richer understanding of their sentiments, in particular the role of women in the milieu. The Plumpters were childhood friends of Opie's, both of the daughters also writers. The first of these letters, written by Anne, discusses copies of her first novel, Antoinette. She tells the recipient she'll be going away with her sister Annabella and their friend Amelia Alderson for a few weeks, but that the copies will reach her if sent to Mrs. John Taylor's home, this being Susanna Taylor. Another set of relationships born from the parlours of family friends, but which provided Susanna, Amelia, Anne, and Annabella at least political and creative agency. Annabella, Anne, and Amelia each starred on stage together as young women in Norwich in a play that Amelia had written called Adelaide. They would later take to the stage again in another more controversial role, which I will come to soon. It's interesting that Anne's first novel, Antoinette, required an apology from the critics. Ahead of one volume of the text, for example, is attached the critical review's character of the work. They published, the title should not lead our readers to suppose that this publication is of political character. It has not the least reference to the affairs of France, and for this reason, we could have wished it had appeared under another name. The present is apt to mislead readers. Whether Anne Plumpter was already well known as a young radical, or reactionary sentiment was so high that even the sound of a French name might inspire mistrust, the review is useful in contextualizing the backdrop against which these women took such a bold stand in the late 1700s. In the second of these letters, Anne writes again of her novel, concerned about finding the right publisher, and as she puts it, increasing as much as lies in her power, her financial capacity for relieving the misery she sees all around her. This, she writes, is incumbent on her as citizen of the world. She thus neatly ties together her religious principles, her political beliefs, and her professional aspirations in a palatable package. I think when I wrote this talk, I didn't think about how hard it would be to say aloud. So literary concerns and radical philosophies often blended together in the correspondence of this set. Opie's letters to Godwin, for example, are replete with passionate politics giving way to eager solicitations for feedback on her manuscripts, discussions of their friends' latest works in the same line as their latest political exploits. Anne's very next line in this second letter, for example, reads, "Poor Thelwall, what you hint of him grieves me to the heart, and is a reproach of unspeakable magnitude to the land in which he lives. Depend on it that I will bear it in mind, nor let any opportunity pass by when it should appear to me that I could serve him. But alas, amongst the Norwich patriots, few are capable of assisting their brethren to a great extent." The camaraderie in this excerpt and the sense that Anne is writing from within a group of equals, that in fact all citizens of the land should be like brethren, points directly to why educated young women like Opie and the Plumpters sought the company of radical circles, even in spite of the dangers present. I will read the rest of this second letter in full because it's difficult to pick out just one or two salient parts. So she continues, "With Thelwall himself, I am charmed. Words cannot express how much charmed. As an orator, he is wonderful. As a man, even more to be admired. Stern only in his adherence to virtue, his manners have an enchanting familiarity in them, which renders him no less delightful in private society than his transcendent powers of oratory render him in the tribune. I shall part with him tomorrow with a regret which nothing can compensate, but the not distant prospect of his returning again amongst us. All I could do in promoting attendance on his lectures, I have done, for both his sake and for the sake of his hearers, who, if they are anything more animated than blocks, cannot fail, I think, to be improved by what they hear. Hitherto they have been well attended. I'm only fearful that an absence of 3 weeks may abate the strong ardour for them which at present persists in the town. About election matters, I will tell you, I have little patience left with my native city. Yet wherefore condemn it en masse? The ones who have elected Windham are as a drop in a bucket when compared with the whole population of the town, and they have brought him in amidst the execrations of the rest of their fellow citizens. Shame on shame that such things can be. Short of voting or standing for office, Plumpter's enthusiasm, assertiveness, and eloquence in both global and local politics shows how far women's industry in this sphere could take them. Plumpter, Opie, and the women in their circle attended political lectures and socialized privately with party figureheads. As scholars have noted, at the time, domestic spaces and public spaces of political dissent were intersecting spheres of Norwich sociability. Not only this, but they canvassed for political speakers, encouraged orators to hold lectures in their city, discussed freely their allegiances with their male peers, and even at times spoke publicly at political rallies. Sarah Scott has been named Sarah Fielding previously. A woman on the side of Windham described what she called the most curious incident when Opie took the political podium herself following his win. She writes, "A young woman of uncommon talents of about 25 years of age made a long speech in the town hall to about 1,500 of the Jacobins assembled, and 2 daughters of a late doctor of divinity stood one on each side of her to encourage her in the proceeding. The girl herself is a daughter to a physician of Scotch creation, lately an apothecary. She is worthy of being enlisted among the Poissards, and I should like to send her among them." Though the account is far from complimentary, we've already heard what Poissards referred to. The novelty of this act is such that it has been hailed as one of the few extant pieces of evidence that prove women took so prominent a role on the political stage. For Amelia Opie, who starred in amateur theatre and was famous in Norwich for her singing, the allure of performance would certainly have explained part of her passion for politics. Another way to account for it could be the educative opportunities it presented. As Roxana Bell stated, parlour politics served as a form of education and expression for women. Anne Plumpter, in her second letter, declared that those who listen to Thelwall cannot fail to be improved by what they hear. Opie similarly wrote frequently of being instructed at the homes of friends she visited. And Anna Enfield, another of their circle, wrote that she was devising a plan of study with a new connection she had made whilst on a visit to family friends. As the Society of Gentlemen heading Opie's Norwich Circle wrote in their radical publication, The Cabinet, "From the cradle to the grave, females are excluded from the very sources whence alone depth of thought and strength of reasoning are acquired, whilst conversation, whose chemic power extracts from the ore its hidden treasure deposited in the mind, is seldom allowed to them its natural and potent operation." More on the cabinet later, but it's important to note that this freedom of sentiment, as Harriet Martineau, another Norwich contemporary, put it, was considered vital for extracting an education from social settings. At Susanna Taylor's home, at least, Opie and her female friends were sure to meet with an array of politically active, progressive men and women who were permitted to speak freely within the safe space of her parlour. Taylor's salons indeed provided what P. Eliot calls a fertile context for female education. Susanna Taylor was arguably one of Opie's closest friends in her youth, and naturally a kind of maternal substitute, about whom it was written, Susanna Taylor's energetic character and liberal opinions, joined with her great kindness of heart, made her a centre of the circle of remarkable people who frequented Norwich. It was not only that her salons provided a safe space for Opie and her female contemporaries to discuss freely everything from personal matters to politics, but this space and security was a movable feast, forming a lifeline when Opie went visiting in London, for example. In both correspondence and tete-a-tetes alike, Opie frequently divulged to Taylor information that she withheld from many others, and their letters provided a sounding board against which Opie could formulate her ideas. As S. Lavori, I don't think I pronounced that right, states, women's letters and journals played an integral part in the process of creating an ethical selfhood, providing a locus for gathering knowledge, reflecting on that knowledge, and integrating it into an individual's subjectivity. I'm just going to give a couple of examples of letters that Opie wrote to Susanna Taylor while she was in London in 1794. The first comes after she called on Godwin for the first time that summer. I think this shows the eagerness with which Opie sought out political discussion as an educative experience, and the way she viewed her relationship to Taylor. Opie at the time was staying with a family friend, a Mr. Boddington in Southgate. She writes, Godwin received me very kindly, but wondered I should think of being out of London. Could I be either amused or instructed at Southgate? This illustrates the dual purpose of a social visit, where pleasure must intertwine with instruction. Godwin's doubts, as Opie will relate, were unfounded. She writes, we went to Daniel Isaac Eaton's shop. We'd scarcely entered it when a very genteel-looking young man came in. You come from Norwich, cried the stranger. Allow me to ask you some questions then, etc. At last, we became so fraternized that Mrs. Eaton shut the shop door and gave us chairs. I will not relate the information I heard, but I could have talked with him all night. Opie goes on to transcribe the radical political conversation that ensued, where after her input, the man replied that she was quite right and that democratic women were rare, and that he heartily wished he could introduce her to two charming patriots at Edinburgh who were, though women, up to circumstances. After enjoying his conversation, Opie states, he took his leave, leaving our minds elevated and delighted. Even from something as innocuous as a casual visit to a friend's shop, then, an accidental acquaintance might be made that would provide an opportunity for learned discussion and for a woman to extend her network of contacts who could elevate her. The second of these letters is far darker in tone. Written in October 1794, ahead of the treason trials, when, as she puts it, the state of the times and other things pressed upon her mind continually, she writes, my father will have told you a great deal. He will have told you, too, how much we are interested and agitated by the probable events of the approaching trials. Would to God you and your husband were equally so, for then would one of my cares be removed. As you would like us, perhaps turn a longing eye towards America as a place of refuge. And one of the strongest ties that bind me to Norwich would be converted into an attraction to lure me to the New World. On this, I hope, however, at all events, we are resolved to emigrate if the event of the trial be fatal. I write to you on this subject in confidence, as we do not wish our intention to be much known at present. How changed I am, how I sicken at the recollection of past follies and past connections, and wish from the bottom of my soul that I had never associated but with you and others like you. The extremity of threatening a voluntary exile should the parties be declared guilty is matched only by Opie's statement further on. Hang these politics, how they haunt me. Would it not be better, think you, to hang the framers of them? Now, if seditious language was what put Hardy, Horne-Tooke, and Thelwall on the stand, then Opie's exclamation here not only highlights how secure she felt in confiding in the sympathetic Taylor, but also perhaps suggests her desire to take an active part in the danger involving those she sought to emulate. Towards the end of that same letter, Opie perhaps lands on the exact way that she could show her commitment and zeal to the cause that preoccupied her mind. She writes, "What a pity it is that the cabinet is dangerous. I should have enjoyed it else so much. I admire what is already written." Founded in 1794, the Cabinet by a Society of Gentlemen was a pro-revolutionary publication conceived by Opie's friends T.S. Norgate and Charles Marsh. It ran fortnightly until the summer of 1795, and though she began by declaiming it as dangerous, Opie eventually embraced the risk so far that she wrote 16 poems and 1 tale for it, more than any other literary contributor. As Anne Plumptre, in the letter we saw earlier, cleverly connected her political beliefs with her literary ambition, Opie similarly used her political zeal to cut her teeth on a career that she would eventually be celebrated for. Missing a page. The death of Amelia Opie prompted an obituary in the Non-Slaveholder, a Quaker anti-slavery periodical published in America. About her is written, "Her sympathies were readily enlisted in the cause of the oppressed, and being intimately acquainted with Wilberforce, Buxton and Co., she watched their efforts on behalf of these with a deep and heartfelt interest." Though her most infamous years of radical politics ended arguably with the death of her husband, John Opie, and the dissolution of the network of radicals she had once called friends, such as Godwin and Taylor, Opie's devotion to political reform continued enduringly until her death in 1853. Her sympathies were indeed readily enlisted in the cause of the oppressed, but she did not simply watch the efforts on behalf of these. From campaigning for prison reform alongside Elizabeth Fry to famously initiating the largest petition of signatures ever presented to Parliament at the time, 187,000 names calling for the abolition of slavery, to conspiring with American suffragette Elizabeth Cady Stanton to publicize women wearing pantaloons in protest to the skirt, Opie did far more than simply watch from the sidelines. Opie cultivated a lifestyle that would put her in the way of a number of varying networks from which she could draw out the features most salient to her and become shaped by a variety of influences not otherwise available to a young single woman from a provincial city in the 18th century.